Welcome to 35 West. I'm Ryan Berg, Director of the Americas Program at CSIS and host of the 35 West podcast.
With how professional the Mexican government.
Are we ready? I don't
reform
think.
trends in Argentina.
Right. And that's what happened.
Role at all in the NAFTA negotiations.
Welcome to 35 West. I'm Ryan Berg, Director of the Americas Program at CSIS and the co-host of the 35 West podcast. Almost every corner of the Western Hemisphere has been touched by the monumental challenge of irregular migration. From Central America, and particularly the countries of El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, where countless people have uprooted their lives in search of new opportunities, from Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Cuba, where repression, persecution, and catastrophic economic policies by authoritarian regimes have generated, in the Venezuelan case, the largest mass migration outside of an active war zone, to a continually evolving crisis in Haiti. Migration is one of the signal challenges for our shared hemisphere. However, addressing the multifaceted and context-specific manifestations of irregular migration is no small feat. An effective response to the migratory movements we are observing therefore hinges on cooperation with partners in the region at all levels, on-the-ground knowledge, and close cooperation with and within the U.S. government. To help us unpack this multifaceted issue, we are very pleased to be joined today by Michael Camilleri, Acting Assistant Administrator of USAID's Bureau for Latin America and the Caribbean. He joins us today to discuss the agency's role at the forefront of the United States' efforts to address the root causes of migration, assist with integration, and provide security for vulnerable populations in transit. Assistant Administrator Camilleri, welcome to 35 West podcast.
Thanks, Ryan. Great to be with you.
Michael, you are no stranger to the challenges affecting our shared hemisphere and efforts to address the root causes of migration in particular. You previously directed the Northern Triangle Task Force at USAID and served as the Western Hemisphere advisor on the Secretary of State's policy planning staff. Could you sketch for us a scene setter for the audience? What would you describe as the greatest challenges the Western Hemisphere faces today in terms of migration?
Thanks, Ryan. Yeah, great question to kick us off. The big challenge, or perhaps the biggest challenge, as you note, is that migration is impacting almost every corner of our hemisphere. So from Chile in the south to Canada in the north, and certainly including here in the United States, we see almost all countries are either a country of origin, a country of transit, or a country of destination for migrants. In some cases, they're all three. So we see 20 million people now from Latin America who are forcibly displaced or stateless in the Americas. Close to 10 million of them have displaced across borders. So the scale of this challenge and the breadth of it geographically requires us to respond in a coordinated manner as a hemisphere. And the president's leadership on this has been critical, including and since the Summit of the Americas in Los Angeles a couple of years ago. But at the same time, we need to recognize that the drivers and the impacts of migration are distinct in different parts of the hemisphere. And you spoke to this as well in mentioning some of the specific situations of critical concern. And so our responses also need to be differentiated and context specific. So let me give you just a couple of examples. You mentioned Venezuela, where Maduro's repression and autocratic mismanagement has really decimated the economy and driven now some 7.7 million Venezuelans to flee the country. Most of them, 6.5 million of the 7.7 million, within South America. So there we're focused, first and foremost on trying to help Venezuela return to a democratic path, which we see as fundamental to addressing the root cause of why Venezuelans are feeling the need to flee their country, but also in the meantime supporting the very generous kind of patchwork of regularization and integration policies that countries elsewhere in the region have put in place that have allowed the vast majority of these Venezuelans to find some place of refuge, a place to find work, to put their kids in schools, to have access to basic services in Colombia, in Brazil, in Ecuador, in Peru, in Chile. And so we've helped, for example, just in Colombia, provide legal residency to some 2 million migrants and similar work in the other countries that I've mentioned. So that's Venezuela. Central America is where we've been really focused as USAID with our root causes work under the president's root causes strategy. And there, what we're looking at is trying to improve governance, create job opportunities, take action to address the underlying reasons why people feel like they need to relocate, which in that case are less political and more about seeking economic opportunity, seeking security, in some cases, being victimized by government corruption, for example, but not the same kind of political dynamics we see in Venezuela. So we're in Central America, we're boosting sales and employment for small businesses. We're helping farmers increase their productivity. We're improving education and vocational training. We're supporting anti-corruption reformers. And we have promising, I think, evidence that I'm sure we'll get into of the impact this effort is having.
In the years since the root causes strategy was adopted, I think it's fair to say the term root causes has become something of a household name among those who follow migration and development. Let's begin by looking at the origins of this strategy, Michael. How did the root causes strategy come to be? What made this approach unique from previous frameworks?
Sure. Yeah. So the root causes strategy was the product of some really intensive work during the early months of the Biden-Harris administration. It was launched, I think, in June or July of 2021. So those kind of first 6 months of the administration were really focused on doing kind of a deep dive into why individuals were feeling the need to flee Central America and then devising a strategy that was, responsive. This idea was not a new one. There had been a kind of a parallel strategy under the Obama administration. Then Vice President Biden had been, responsible for leading a lot of that work in his capacity and traveled several times to the region. What's different, I think, in terms of the root causes strategy is a few things. And it comes down to scale, scope, and sustainability. So in terms of scale, what we've seen under this administration is a kind of another level of attention and resources being devoted to Central America. So far, since the root causes strategy was adopted, we have invested some $2.9 billion in addressing the root causes in Central America with a focus on the countries of Northern Central America. In addition, with the vice president's leadership, we've been able to mobilize over $5 billion in private sector investment for the region. So in terms of the scale here, what we're able to do is unprecedented in bringing investment and both public and private investment to the region. In terms of scope, we are, continuing to focus on issues of democratic governance, of economic opportunity, of citizen security. But we've added a focus on human and labor rights, as well as gender-based violence. And even in, the pillars that are more familiar, looking at kind of new expressions of the factors, the push factors leading to displacement. One of those is climate change and the increasing impacts of climate change in the region and the way that that's having very tangible impacts on push factors for migration. So again, in all of these areas, we are very much data-driven, including with a very useful MOU we have with CBP, which allows us to kind of geo-target not just what we're doing, but where we're doing it in Central America, focusing our programs on high out-migration communities, and then being able to kind of measure our progress over time. We also use survey data and other sources to kind of triangulate the inputs to decide, what we're doing and where we're doing it in the region. And then finally, in terms of sustainability, we have introduced a really strong focus on working and empowering local partners. And this is a matter of conviction for Administrator Power. It builds on the work of prior administrators as well. But the insight here is that we can be more adaptable, more responsive, and more effective and sustainable if we're working with local partners. And unfortunately, we had kind of the negative experience in 2019 when the prior administration cut off aid to Central America. There was a GAO report that documented the really significant negative impact of that. And one of the lessons learned was that we need to really embed in local communities and local partners the work that we're doing so that it's sort of resilient to any shifts that may take place in our own ability to support the good things that are happening in Central America. Now, we are hopeful, and I will certainly argue for the self-interest from a U.S. national security perspective of remaining invested for the long term in Central America. But equally, we need to be thinking hard about how we empower local actors to be able to lead their own development. And so we have just in the past 3 or 4 years gone from something like 3% of our funding in Northern Central America going directly to local organizations to now over 20% and growing of the funding going to such organizations. And I've had the chance in visiting the region to visit whether it's in the food security space, whether it's helping victims of trafficking, whether it's helping kids in marginalized communities stay out of gangs and complete their education. Some really inspiring, and I'm sure you've met many of these people as well, Ryan, really inspiring community leaders in Central America that want to do good by their communities and by their countries and provide citizens a reason to stay, build their lives at home. And we want to be investing and empowering them.
The strategy requires close collaboration across a range of U.S. agencies. And as you just mentioned, Michael, USAID is at the forefront. You gave an excellent overview of a lot of the major initiatives that USAID and its partners are undertaking. I want to ask you, how has USAID been coordinating with the Interagency to maximize its impact?
Yeah, short answer is very closely. And the root causes strategy is interagency by design. It was led by the National Security Council and the Vice President's office in its drafting as well as in its implementation. But let me give you just a few concrete examples of how this works in practice. One is our work on citizen security, which actually is not new, but under the Central America Regional Security Initiative that is now over a decade old, we've embarked at USAID together primarily with the International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Bureau, INL, at the State Department on a sustained and concerted investment in evidence-based violence prevention programming in Central America. And the impacts there, I think, are quite significant in terms of homicide rates, which in El Salvador and Honduras, for example, had been among the highest in the world. Not quite so high in Guatemala, but still elevated. And we've cut all of those, in half and more over the period of time in which we've been using this kind of place-based strategy for bringing our interagency toolkit to bear on violence prevention in the region. Another example is the one I mentioned, the Central America Forward initiative led by the Vice President, which has now mobilized over $5 billion in investment for the region. USAID is proud to have directly supported 19 of the now 50 plus private sector partnerships that have been mobilized under that initiative. A third example is our Voices initiative, which was announced by Administrator Power at the Summit of the Americas in 2022. This is an interagency partnership to protect, preserve, and expand civic space, which is a challenge, particularly in some parts of the region, Nicaragua being the sort of the outlier case, and as you have spoken and written widely about, Ryan, but also in other areas of the region, some concerning trends that require concerted action to protect civic space. And then the final thing I'll mention is just the DFC, the Development Finance Corporation, which is a new tool, one we didn't have when we were doing this in the Obama administration. The Development Finance Corporation was created by the BUILD Act in 2018 and gives us kind of an expanded toolkit for bringing private capital to developing countries. And we've been able to really leverage the DFC's work to good effect as a complement to the kinds of things that USAID can do on the development front. I was in Guatemala just a few weeks ago with Secretary Blinken and others. And as part of that visit, the DFC announced a $20 million loan, for example, to a Guatemalan savings and loan cooperative, which will then support the expansion of low-income mortgages for the construction of borrowers' first homes. So this is, expanding access to credit. It's helping lower income Guatemalans get access to housing, but also obviously contributing to the local economy in terms of the work that goes into constructing those houses. So a kind of private sector market solution to a key development challenge. And we've been able to do similar things in El Salvador and Honduras.
It can often feel as if the conversation in the U.S. around migration, which of course tends to focus around numbers on the southern border first and foremost, that conversation can sometimes be disconnected from that of the conversation taking place within the region, where intra-regional migration has been a reality and a challenge for several countries. How does the root causes strategy and more broadly U.S. leadership on migration work to rectify this disconnect?
Thanks, Ryan. That's a great question. And look, it's natural, I think, for those of us sitting in the United States to focus on how migration impacts us here at home, right? And what's happening on the border and happening in our communities when migrants arrive. But as your question suggests, migrants arriving at our border often do so after incredibly arduous and difficult and dangerous journeys. And they undertake those journeys in the vast majority of cases, not because they want to leave their homes, their families, their communities, but because they feel like they have no other option. And so with the root causes strategy, what we're trying to do is precisely understand why are people taking this extremely difficult, risky decision? Why are they putting everything at risk for a very uncertain journey to our southern border? And what can we do to actually address the factors that are leading them to take that decision? And so, the $2.9 billion now and counting that we've been able to invest in Central America, thanks to the generosity of U.S. citizen taxpayers, is precisely an investment in addressing those, what we call the push factors, the reasons, the economic insecurity, the physical insecurity, the sense of indignity, the sense that, which I think we can all identify with, of wanting to provide better for one's family. That's leading too many people, frankly, in Central America to undertake that decision. I had a conversation once with a former vice president of Guatemala who said, for many young people in my country, they've already migrated. And that was, I think, a really powerful statement. And it gives us a sense of kind of what we're up against. And I think what he meant by it was that for many, many young people in Guatemala, in this case, the only chance for a kind of dignified, hopeful future is by leaving their own country, leaving their communities, leaving their families behind, again, in this incredibly difficult and dangerous and uncertain way. And that's what we need to change. We're not going to do it alone. We need strong leadership in the region. We need to work in partnership with government leaders, with private sector leaders, with civil society in Central America. But we can be catalytic. I think we've shown that we can have an impact, particularly when we're working in partnership with our colleagues in the region. And in doing so, we have the conviction that for more and more Central Americans, there will be hope for a dignified future in their own communities and countries.
With the release of the Root Causes Strategy Results Report, I'm wondering if you could spotlight for us, Michael, some of the highlights of this document. What, in your opinion, have been the main successes thus far of the Root Causes Strategy? And perhaps, if you might, identify some room for improvement.
Sure. Happy to do that, Ryan. So look, the root causes strategy, and much of what we're doing under the root causes strategy is sort of by definition long-term. I think that's sort of intuitive. We're trying to affect some pretty structural constraints on Central American economies and societies in a way that changes the decisional calculus of individuals in terms of where they see their futures. That said, I think, we're already seeing some pretty promising results under the root causes strategy on multiple levels. At the sort of programmatic level, at the level of the kind of specific interventions of the U.S. Agency for International Development in the region, we know that we're having a positive impact on the lives of literally hundreds of thousands of individuals and families in Central America. So we know we've helped over 60,000 farmers in Guatemala and Honduras increase production and increase their incomes. We know that we've provided technical support to over 5,000 government officials in the region, as well as NGO representatives, to improve their systems of accountability and take action against corruption. We know that we're helping governments in the region provide improved basic services like waste collection, public lighting, water treatment, nutrition. So really hitting citizens, where they can feel it in terms of those public services. We know that we've reached over 27,000 people just last year in the region with our gender-based violence programming, and over 90,000 youth with our violence prevention program. So we know at that level that we're having, this positive impact. The bigger question is, of course, what is the knock-on effect on migration, right? We have a strategy to address the root causes of migration. Are we seeing, those root causes actually being affected in a tangible way? And I think here again, the early data suggests that we are. We know, for example, that in a vocational training program that we ran in El Salvador, we saw a 13% increase in the youth that were planning to stay in El Salvador. In Honduras, we've seen with our basic education programming, higher school retention, lower dropout rates, and then lower rates of outmigration. There's a strong association between school dropouts and kind of the junior high age range, and then folks deciding to leave the country shortly thereafter. So we've documented in a statistically significant way our ability to kind of affect those trend lines. Pulling back the aperture kind of even more, when we look at the region as a whole, we do see declining rates of both intentions and actual migration. Now, here I want to be a little bit careful because we can't claim a causal effect in the same way that we can in terms of our specific programs. But I do think it's notable that at a time when we have seen increased migration from much of Latin America, we are seeing declining both intentions and actual migration from Guatemala and Honduras, two of the focus countries under the root causes strategy, and essentially flat lines in El Salvador. So again, not claiming causality, but the coincidence of significant, sustained, data-driven USAID investments in these three countries and the positive trend lines on migration vis-a-vis what we're seeing elsewhere in the hemisphere, I think is at the very least quite notable.
Michael, you mentioned connecting migrants to services and country, and I know ensuring populations in transit are able to connect with services, opportunities, and support systems in host countries is critical. Could you talk more about how USAID is supporting the integration of migrants?
Thanks, Ryan. Yeah, look, I think this is maybe one of the unheralded kind of success stories of Latin America over the last, 5 or 10 years. We've seen countries in the region respond to the Venezuelan displacement crisis with really remarkable generosity and policy ingenuity. Now, it is far, far from perfect. But as I mentioned, of the 7.7 million Venezuelans that have had to flee the cataclysmic economic mismanagement and political repression under Maduro, 6.5 million have remained relocated within the region, 85% of them just within 4 countries, Colombia, Peru, Ecuador, and Brazil, which together have granted temporary protected status to over 3 million people, allowing them to settle closer to home. What we've done at USAID is tried to come in, behind that generosity and those programs. And we've seen, so the way we do this is to work with local governments, both national governments and municipal governments, to regularize, to provide documentation to migrants, and then provide them access to public services. I was in Bogota just a couple of weeks ago, had a chance to visit one of the 11 integration centers that we help to support in the country. I did so with the Bogota Mayor Galan, who's a really inspiring leader and somebody I think of tremendous conviction and vision on this front, and met with a Venezuelan migrant named Gendry, who had fled Venezuela, arrived in Bogota with his wife and his 2 young daughters, initially showed up at the integration center just to get an ID card, came back to get his daughters into school, came back to look for a job. And he was just beaming with pride as he talked about, he's working now as a driver for Transmilenio, which is you probably know, Ryan, the kind of urban bus system, a real model for urban transport in the region. So he's found good employment. He's contributing to the local municipality. He was bragging about how his daughters are top of their class in school. And he was not just grateful for everything that the integration center had provided him in terms of being able to set up a new life for himself and his family in Colombia, but also proud of now feeling like he's able to give back to the country. And what we're seeing increasingly is that the countries in the region that with our support have made these investments in integration are feeling the return on that investment. In Bogota, for example, in the last 2 years, 9,000 immigrant-owned businesses have created more than 188,000 new jobs. And those are jobs not just for migrants, but for Colombians in this case. So there is a positive return on these investments, but it does require, some political courage and some financial investment on the front end. And what we're trying to do as USAID is help to bear some of that cost alongside our partners in the region to make this integration possible.
I'd like to talk about some of the new push factors, such as climate change. Michael, you mentioned that once in one of your responses, but it's forecasted to be one of the largest development challenges in the hemisphere going forward, undermining economic security and in the process exacerbating some of the root causes that we've been discussing. So how is USAID approaching the climate migration nexus and seeking to improve resiliency in the face of extreme weather?
Thanks, Ron. Yeah, as you say, Latin American Caribbean generates just 10% of global greenhouse gas emissions, but suffers some of the worst effects of global warming. Last year was the warmest on record for the region. We're bracing ourselves for a a tough hurricane season, unfortunately. And we're seeing how climate change has made the recent extreme heat and heat wave in the American Southwest, Mexico, and Central America, 35 times more likely. Climate change shocks and disasters have doubled in Latin America and the Caribbean in the last 30 years. And that includes not just hurricanes, but floods, droughts, loss of glaciers. Just this year, we've helped to respond as USAID to wildfires in Chile and Colombia, as well as the really devastating flooding in southern Brazil. This is unfortunately, I think, going to be increasingly an area of focus for us, both on the humanitarian assistance side as well as the development side across the region. And as your question suggests, there are clear linkages and inextricable linkages really to migration. When people can't grow their crops or their communities face increasing numbers of extreme weather events, they naturally want to find somewhere more stable and with greater opportunities. We have seen, I think, in the data we're collecting, both a particular proclivity for food insecurity to spark spikes in outmigration. An analysis in Honduras, for example, found that being food insecure increases by 33% the likelihood of having intentions to migrate. And another study looking more broadly at Northern Central America found that recent drier than usual local growing seasons generated 70.7% more migration to the United States. So clearly, these increased climate impacts have a tangible knock-on effect on what we're discussing here, which is addressing root causes of migration. So what are we doing about it? Again, the short answer is many things, but I'll just mention a few examples of USAID's growing portfolio in this space. We have created, since the launch of the root causes strategy, new programs in Guatemala and Honduras that have begun to help people and communities build resilience and reduce their vulnerability. In Honduras, we've trained about 14,000 people on adaptation strategies and raised more than $600,000 in non-U.S. government finance for climate adaptation. In Guatemala, just last year, we launched 2 new agricultural activities, providing innovative climate-smart technologies to farmers. And in El Salvador, we're building government capacity to mobilize resources and invest in climate-resilient infrastructure and disaster risk reduction. I'll just mention one other thing, which came up actually in the conversation with President Arevalo in Guatemala when I was there a few weeks ago, which is crop insurance for farmers. When we think about not just the impacts, but the uncertainty that comes with a changing climate, as well as we're seeing now, both El Nino and La Nina, we have worked with the Guatemalan Ministry of Agriculture to provide parametric crop insurance to approximately 60,000 farmers. And we're looking now to provide assistance to help scale that insurance model to reach more farmers, which again, President Arevalo in his conversation with us singled out as a particular priority given some of these dynamics.
Labor shortages are a reality for many countries around the world, including in the United States, especially as populations age in the coming decades. With so many people in our region looking for opportunities, it seems like there should be a way to connect this supply to the demand. How is USAID engaging around labor migration?
Yeah, thanks for the question. This is, I think, maybe a less conventional, but a really exciting area of the work that we've been doing in the region. As you said, Ryan, there is a mismatch of labor supply and demand in the region. And that includes here in the United States, where we have some critical labor shortages. And so there is a potential for a kind of win-win-win if we can address those critical labor shortages for the U.S. economy and U.S. businesses, if we can provide safe, legal, temporary, ethical legal pathways for workers who need jobs, and then if we can have those workers return to their home communities and invest the money that they earn in building a house or starting a business or sending their kids to school, and so that there's a positive knock-on effect in terms of the development of their own countries and communities. And so what we've been able to do in just a few short years at USAID is work closely with government institutions in Northern Central America, Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, to expand their capacity to provide ethical opportunities for working abroad, mainly to the United States, but also to places like Spain and Canada. And we have nearly tripled in the past 3 fiscal years the number of Northern Central American citizens who are traveling to the United States on H-2 temporary labor visas. And again, that's a win for our economy. That's a win for the workers. It's a win for their home economies. It's also something that has a proven impact on decreasing demand for irregular migration. So we have very new data that shows that in communities where there's been access to these H-2 visas, immigration was around 11%, irregular migration, versus 30% in communities that did not have access to such visas. So I think what we take from this is that, there is a demand for migration, which we are working to affect over the long term with our work on root causes. But in the short term, we have this tool, which is, labor pathways, which can absorb some of that demand for migration and demonstrate to individuals who may be thinking about migration that there is an alternative to taking this, the dangerous, uncertain, path of relying on a coyote to try to reach the U.S. southern border, and then everything that comes with that, and in terms of us, of course, enforcing our laws, but rather doing so in a way that is within the framework of the rule of law, that allows them to stay connected to their communities, to come here or travel to another country, earn a salary, and then return home and be able to invest that salary to improve their lives and their families. So I think we see this as a really promising area of collaboration and work with our Central American partners.
Michael, is there anything that we did not cover in this podcast? Is there something that you would like to highlight or add for our listeners?
Thanks, Ryan. I've really enjoyed the conversation. I would just maybe end where we started, which is to say, compared to when we were looking at this challenge, even, 5 years ago or so, it's really become a regional phenomenon, a regional challenge, one that we have to work closely with our partners throughout the Western Hemisphere to address. And so with President Biden's leadership under the LA Declaration on Migration and Protection, we've now built a framework for that cooperation that includes the root causes work that we discussed. It includes working on integration and reintegration, as we discussed. It includes the work to expand legal labor pathways, as we just mentioned, as well as, of course, working on the protection enforcement pieces with our interagency partners. And so we're grateful for the opportunity to discuss that work and look forward to continuing the conversation.
Acting Assistant Administrator Michael Camilleri, thanks for joining us on 35 West. We appreciate you taking the time.
Thanks so much.
For you, thank you for joining. Stay tuned for the next episode of 35 West.